Hello, and welcome back to the Futurism at J2 podcast. Today I'm joined by Max and Ricardo,
Hello.
What's up?
and today's topic is the environment and sustainable tech and biomimicry. So, to kind of get this conversation started, Ricardo, would you like to talk about where we're at in terms of sustainable tech?
Yeah, so one of the things that actually brought upon this question of biomimicry and things that we actually, look at in nature and then apply to our everyday lives was something of an interesting case where, we see bridges every day. We sometimes wonder about their construction. Some of them look like they would work, and then some other ones look like engineering marvels where you've probably seen a lot of bridges that have an oval shaped under them, and you might be wondering, like, how does that work? Why does that even work? And actually, one example of this in nature that might have been the inspiration for a lot of these bridge designs is actually an egg. So, as you guys know, probably an egg is super fragile. You can easily crush it, but if you try to apply pressure from the top and bottom evenly at the same time, you'll find that it's extremely hard to actually crack that egg. So, with that in mind, different physical attributes of that egg have been transported into the construction of different bridges. And things of that same nature have happened all around us, where we try to look at nature and how it does things because, as some might consider it, nature is the best teacher. It has had so much time to develop and make the best adaptable creatures for the environment that they're in. And what better way of being able to adapt our technologies into our current world than to look at these many different creatures and take the best from each one of them to try and make our society a little bit better and a little bit more sustainable in everyday life. And so with that, I just wanted to ask you guys, what are some examples that you've seen and what are you excited to see out of biomimicry? Is it something that you guys think is going to be adapted more into everyday life, such as buildings and other technologies, or do you think it's something that is more constrained to different technologies that we might not necessarily see in our everyday lives?
Tough question. I think that one thing, Nicholas, you and I were talking yesterday about spider silk. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that? And how, I'm not sure how it's used, but like I know that there is some biomimicry there. Like
Yeah,
as far as like specific technology that's in play today.
yeah, for sure. So, like going off the egg example, another example of kind of using what nature has given us throughout millions of years of evolution is spider silk, which it has the tensile strength of steel, so it's incredibly strong, but it's also incredibly flexible. So you could use it for many different applications, whereas steel is very limited. Like it's strong, but you can't mold it into different applications. And with the idea of biomimicry in general, it's just basically using, studying the natural world around us and seeing the structures that exist and then trying to incorporate them in the technologies that we develop. So, one example I always think of is like architecture. So, designing very stable structures like bridges, like Ricardo was talking about, and also, this kind of gets into biophilicity or being biophilic, but basically coexisting with nature and kind of closing the gap between humans and nature. In other words, kind of molding us together into one ecology, like one big world. Because I think right now, technology has kind of driven us away from nature. And I think in order for us to be a sustainable species, we need to kind of move back into nature and bring nature into our everyday lives a lot more. So, ideas would be um, incorporating more like trees, more nature, more animals, having plants indoors, and creating open windows and like bringing in more sunlight. And I think if the more and more we can incorporate nature into our daily lives, the more I think appreciation we'll have for nature, and hopefully the more creative we'll be. I even would go so far to say that incorporating more nature into our lives will actually allow us to become more creative and think of more technological development. So it's kind of a multifaceted idea. So not only mimicking nature through biomimicry, but kind of being part of nature and appreciating it through biophilicity. So it's kind of a big idea, but I don't know. That's kind of where I see us heading if we want to be sustainable as a species.
Yeah, sure. Going off of that point, there's this author. His name is Daniel Quinn, and he writes a lot about sort of this. He writes a lot about basically exactly what you're saying, trying to integrate um, people with nature again, because he writes about the idea that basically his main thesis in a lot of his writing is the agricultural revolution was the beginning of the end, because during the agricultural revolution is when we started hoarding food instead of just taking what we needed, which allowed us to have more time to like start creating technological advancements, and it sort of separated us from nature in a way that was suddenly not sustainable, because suddenly we have population problems due to a much larger food source, which suddenly makes people not living in ways that aren't sustainable because they are, quote, breaking the laws of ecology in that way. Like he sort of sees like the laws of ecology as like all being, I guess, in a way, in the sense where if you break the laws of ecology, you're living in a way that is not sustainable, and the punishment for breaking the laws of ecology is essentially death on a massive, massive scale at some point down the road. So this idea of like using biomimicry not only in our in like specific technical instances, but sort of in a philosophical way, like figuring out how we can sort of live in a way that's sustainable by not necessarily mimicking the environment, but by integrating that lifestyle into like integrating the two lifestyles into one, because naturally that's sort of how humans are, quote, designed to be or have evolved to exist, right? So trying to integrate the way that the natural world works into the way that we live will sort of inevitably lead to a healthier lifestyle, because it's the way that our bodies are sort of meant to, quote, meant to exist in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I remember you mentioning we've kind of broken the laws of ecology in a way, like we've exploited the earth to a point. I mean, really, since the agricultural revolution, like you said, we've been exploiting it to a point that was
there's like this idea of like manipulating the landscape for your purposes, as opposed to like living within the landscape is kind of like the idea behind that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this kind of goes back to my point of being biophilic, but okay, this is also shifting the conversation more to actual technology.
Yeah, sure.
But how can we create, or what ideas, what technologies could we develop that will allow us to, I guess, be more minimalist, I would say, instead of, consumption, and using more than we need and being inefficient with our resources. Like, what kind of technologies do you see that will allow us to better use energy, to kind of, I guess, just coexist with the natural world better, and also just be more sustainable as a species?
Yeah, sure. I can sort of address my thoughts on this. So I've thought about this a lot, about sustainability, and I thought that basically massive corporation and like the fact that we're living societal, I guess our society is so global, and it's just so big. Like every person is sort of dependent on every other person to an extent, in some capacity, right? Like the idea of capitalism is like, oh, I go and I do this job so that I can produce this thing and then get money so I can buy other goods and services, right? And I sort of thought that once we reach some sort of technological peak, you wouldn't necessarily have to have that anymore, right? Like people could live comfortably off of renewable resources, right? In small villages, right? Like, say for example, you could have a whole um, group of people living up in the mountains. I mean, of course, this presents there are a lot of problems that ideas like this present. This is not a fully fleshed out idea, but it's sort of just a start to thinking about sustainability. Like you could have people living in very remote areas, um, that are able to farm for themselves and still live comfortably because they have heat, because they're able to use solar panels to get energy. That's a sustainable way of living that can sort of, and if you are able to keep your food sources limited, um, instead of having that sort of unlimited access to food, that would make it so that you have a population control of sorts, like a natural population control, without there being, without there being too much, without it being too inhumane, right? So like being conscious of that and just living in a small community, I think, like if we lived in much, much, much smaller communities, I think it could help us be more, like live more sustainably rather than depending on, I guess, capitalism in a way to sort of fulfill our needs and keep wanting more and more, right? Like being happy with living sort of minimally. So I think it's less a shift in technology, a little bit more a shift in like lifestyle things, but I think the technology is sort of a way that we're able to live that lifestyle, if that makes sense. Like sustainable technology is the pathway to a lifestyle that is sustainable.
Yeah, I also think in that exact same way. I don't know, but this is me. Even though I'm a CS major, even though I
Sure.
love technology, I also love the idea of just being out in the woods, living a peaceful, comfortable life where you don't really have to mess with a lot of things, you're just in peace with the things around you. And I think one of the biggest like compromises to that is like you were saying, capitalism. And one of the things that I see it as a big downfall towards being more sustainable and being more in tune with nature is the fact that we are very wasteful simply because we have a lot of things or we have
Yeah,
access to a lot
really.
of things. Because think about it, if we didn't have access to as many food resources or as many technological advancements, then we would be more conscious of how we use those technologies or those resources available to us. Because, of course, we don't want to waste something that we can't readily obtain, right? So, food, you see a lot of food wastage, you see a lot of, everyday technologies being wasted, phones being thrown in the trash, different kinds of things where there will come a point, I believe, that those resources that we take for granted right now will become so scarce that the way to becoming more sustainable will not be out of you wanting to become more sustainable, but just out of pure necessity that we have to elongate how much we have available to us, right? So I personally believe that we should think of this sooner rather than later so we can avoid things like that and just live more comfortably now and for the rest of until the next big technological advancement rather than having to starve off valuable resources just because we wasted so many of them.
Yeah, totally agree.
This is reminding me. You took this class with me, but expository writing, technology in the future of work.
Yes.
We had a whole unit on basically the distribution of resources. And so one example is food waste, like you said. I think the statistic is like we waste like 40% of our food or something, like something ridiculous.
Yeah.
And that 40% could go to the people who need the food. So
Right.
in theory, we have enough food to go around, right? Like we're a very productive society in terms of, resources. It's really a distribution of it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Distribution is.
it kind of goes to society as a whole. Like, the rich have like the vast majority of the resources and they're kind of just hoarding it
Right.
from the rest of the population. So it kind of gets into like the inequity aspect of it. But another idea, this is actually from my macroeconomics class. Another idea is, and this is going into the electric cars kind of debate. but with, I'm sorry, I'm kind of changing gears, but with internal combustion engines. So basically the gas guzzling CO2 emitting cars that we currently have. If we were to start adopting more electric vehicles, part of the problem is there's already all these internal combustion engine cars out there. And if you think of it as a bathtub, so right now the bathtub is pretty much filled to the brim. I was telling Max about this.
Yeah.
It's pretty much filled to the brim with, these unsustainable cars, right? And if you're just adding, this water on the top for electric cars, it's really not going to make a big impact. So I think part of the thing with sustainability is not only introducing new sustainable tech, but also getting rid of the old unsustainable tech or somehow converting it. So one idea Max had was, could we, because the big problem with CO2 emitting cars is the exhaust and the CO2 emitted. So your idea was to basically, we have a filter that can, I guess, suck up that CO2. I mean, do you want to elaborate on
somehow
that?
scrub it. Like somehow scrub the CO2 out of the, or just anything that's coming out of the exhaust. Because a lot of people propose, sort of trying to transform a car into a sustainable thing, when really it would cost less to buy a new car than to completely transform your car into something sustainable. So if you're able to make your car so that it's not emitting those things into the air just by slapping something onto the exhaust or wherever you need to. I'm not a car guy, so bear with me. But if you're able to sort of filter out the bad things that we're pumping into the air, it would sort of be an easy solution in that we wouldn't necessarily, people don't accept change very kindly. So this would be a way where we could start becoming more sustainable without having to change our lifestyle too much, right? Because these are the two things that we balance, like keeping lifestyle or being more sustainable, because right now we're not, it's just trying to find that nice balance, right? Yeah, that was just one idea.
I thought that was genius.
I think another thing that a lot of people are actually working on, and I'm not exactly sure where it is right now, but I have remembered seeing a video or two on this. People are trying to develop essentially big vacuums that suck up CO2 right from the air.
Ooh.
Interesting.
And trying to convert, either storing that in the ground, so that it doesn't end up affecting us in the surface with the clean air, or sucking that up, storing some of it underground, and then trying to transform another part of it into fuel for cars to use. Which I think those are extremely hopeful ideas, and I really think they will work. But the problem with those mostly is just getting the money to fund the research and then implementing them all over the world. Which it's a big accomplishment if they do manage to make it as efficient as possible. And it would also prove to be a way where it doesn't end up affecting the lives of a lot of people. You'll just have a big sucking center in the middle of a city, and everybody else can go about their ways for the most part, driving their cars like they have used to.
I'd love that, just a giant vacuum in the middle of the city.
Right?
Dang.
So yeah, there are many different technologies that are trying to achieve similar things, and hopefully these will be developed more to where they're efficient enough and reliable enough that we can put them, all over different places. One example of it being China with, big cities like Hong Kong and many industrial sectors not necessarily having the best air quality, perhaps being able to suck a lot of those, bad actors in the environment could maybe help their situation. And we'll probably see a big change in not only the happiness index of people just living not in a smog city, but also their health, which is also super important, and another reason why I think being sustainable, or at least more careful about the environment, should be important.
Yeah, and like, isn't there a statistic, like, just sort of throwing this out there, but isn't there a statistic that asthma, like, is way more prevalent now than it ever has been in recorded history or something? I don't remember
that's
the
probably
exact
true, yeah.
number, but I do remember hearing, like, there was a huge jump in people who have asthma and struggle with it, which is sort of interesting, just sort of goes to show that we are being directly impacted by the smog that we're pumping into the atmosphere.
I really like your point, Ricardo, because I don't even think, well, I guess I mentioned it a little, but being more sustainable and developing sustainable technologies will make us a more happy society.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
it's not just for the environment, it's also ourselves, right? And obviously it's, the environment and climate change is an existential threat as well. So it's not just, it's really, it comes down to, do we want to be here for,
Right.
hundreds, thousands,
Right.
tens of thousands of years? Or like, do we want to destroy ourselves in the next like century? You know what I
Right.
mean?
Like, it's getting to the point of like, do we want to like not suffocate our children? Like, as morbid as that is, like, that's kind of what it's getting to.
Exactly.
I think you and I were saying that sustainable tech is the future because it has to be,
Oof.
right? Like,
Quote of the
it,
day.
like it has to be. If we, I mean, our prime instinct is survival, right?
Yeah.
So if we want to survive, that's the only way at this point.
Yeah. I mean, right now I'm kind of envisioning like, this is very
No, you're all good.
big,
Yeah,
but like,
go for it.
I'm envisioning a humanity where we're 100% renewable. We're using solar power, wind power, geothermal, and like, it just feels better to me. Like, why are we
Right.
using resources that are finite and we're polluting the air? It's
So the biggest thing is just lobbying, really.
yeah.
It's
I was gonna say
yeah,
capitalism and
capitalism
for
right.
gain, but I think eventually renewable tech is, and it probably is becoming more economically profitable.
Oh,
Like,
so-
I know the costs of these things are going down like
No, yeah.
exponentially.
Like, what happens a lot of the time, and this is sort of like leaving science and going into political science a little bit, but what ends up happening is some extremely profitable renewable tech breakthrough will occur, and then the first person who buys the patent is an oil company, right? And then they keep it and they don't do anything with it, right?
Bruh.
Like, doesn't that just... I hate that. But that happens. That's like one of the big reasons why renewable tech growth has been stunted. I mean, it's kind of profitable, but it's not like we don't see it anywhere, right? Because of that, there would be we'd be light years ahead of where we were now if it weren't for energy companies being so greedy.
Yeah, I think that's really what it comes down to. It's just human greed.
But let's stay positive.
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 I mean, one really good example of, I guess, sustainable tech. Well, you could argue this is not like fully sustainable, but like Tesla, right? I think that's probably the farthest we've gotten. Like, the most ubiquitous company I've seen in terms of creating an electric vehicle, or like a tech that doesn't primarily rely on like fossil fuels and stuff. Obviously, you have to think about where the electricity comes from, and the vast majority of electricity is from fossil fuels.
Right, yeah.
But as we slowly kind of change the proportion of fossil fuels that are used to create electricity, the fact that we already have these cars out there, they're going to become more and more and more sustainable as they're powered by solar and wind. And to me, that's a lot better than just straight up using fossil fuels. Like, I'd rather part of it at least be from renewable energy. And I'm very hopeful that we can just scale up renewable energy and scale down the fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But big money, big power,
That's
big
true.
politics, it's going to be very hard to stop that, because in the end it's the 1%, and they don't want their money threatened, right? Like, they're going to do everything in their power, and they have been, to stop all of these sustainable tech companies from ruining their business. So I mean, eventually they're going to be out of business, but by that time it's probably too late. So we're going to have to get them out of there as soon as possible.
Right, yeah.
I mean, that's the whole issue.
Speaking of
So-
Tesla, I have a fun little anecdote just about electric cars. So I was doing a report on Holly Herndon, who is a computer music person. She basically, that means that you make music on the computer. I promise this ties into electric cars. I promise. And she was pairing with an audio company who was pairing with a electric car company, trying to develop a sound for electric cars. This kind of ties into the biomimicry thing a little bit too, because what they were trying to do was they were trying to solve the problem of the fact that electric cars are now pretty much silent.
Right.
So they were hitting a lot of things, like it was a danger to visually impaired people. So she was trying to, so essentially what the audio company had said at first was, hey, why don't we make these cars sound like spaceships, right? And Holly Herndon, who is a computer music person and computer music programmer, which basically means that she manipulates audio using programming. She was like, that's a cool solution, but we could do something a lot more interesting and potentially sort of musical. So what she decided to do was thinking about putting microphones all over the car, the outside of the car, so that what it does is it soaks up all of the sound from its environment around it. It uses some sort of audio processor inside of the car to synthesize the sound and process it, and then reflect it back into the city through speakers, right? That way, it would reflect the sound of the environment that it was currently traveling through, and it would make a sound so that it wouldn't hit people and things. But I just thought that was sort of interesting, the way that solution came about. Like, I felt like that was really clever. And it also is a little bit biomimicry, in the sense where, say, for example, if you're driving down a country road, like, it's taking sounds from the environment and then reflecting them back out, in a sense. I mean, it's sort of a very loose connection, but still, I just thought that was cool.
That is the coolest thing. Like, I feel like that really ties in all the topics we've been talking about, because it's biomimicry because you're mimicking the
Right,
sounds
yeah.
of nature. It's biophilic because you're kind of incorporating the environment around you, and it's also sustainable because
It's an
not
electric
only
car.
it's electric car, it's also going to prevent, like electric car deaths.
Right, yeah.
So to me, that's so sick.
I just thought that was a really interesting little story.
Yeah, that's so cool. And with that, this is the end of our Futurism at JHU sustainability episode. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Ricardo, for your awesome input. I really enjoyed this conversation. To the listeners out there, think about what kind of sustainable tech and biomimicry and biophilic innovations you can come up with. And who knows, maybe one of you will, become an entrepreneur in a big company and dismantle all these
All of
capitalists
the hurdles, right? All the
destroying our
hurdles.
world. But I have a lot of hope for humanity. I think we're going to get through it. I mean, there's so many cool innovations out there. So yeah, and we'll see you on the next one.
Awesome. Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye.
Bye.